Yeah, I'm Dewey Thorbeck. I'm an architect in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I've lived for many years. And I'm both a practicing architect, but I've also been connected with the University of Minnesota. And back in 1997, I founded the Center for Rural Design, which was the first time that any kind of effort was done to try to bring design as a problem-solving process to rural issues. Urban design had been taught a great deal, but over time I slowly came to the realization that the design schools and the design professions had fundamentally ignored rural areas. We dealt so much with urban, but just ignored rural. And I thought that rural areas deserved a design discipline, so I started the Center for Rural Design, and then out of that came my first book called Rural Design. And then a second book having to do with the architecture of agriculture, because I've always been very interested in barns, and I was going to do a book on barns originally. I guess I still could do, but that was published in 2017, and then the third book, which is, and I'm doing it as a trilogy, kind of ramping up a lot of the things I am doing academically in research to try to explain rural design and what it can do, and to celebrate rural areas all over the world. Rural design is simply a matter of trying to bring design as a problem-solving process to rural issues. And that's probably one of the issues here is how do you define rural in Cowichan Valley. I always say that wrong, and I apologize to your people. And but there's a lot of natural landscape here, but it's also changing landscape. And rural design can look at the natural landscape as much as the man-made cultivated landscape. It encompasses both of them. So, because we're design, and rural design is one part of it, but urban design is another side. And in a valley like this, you're a mixture of urban and rural. And that's my big point. Even though I concentrated on rural design, I really think we have to, for the future, look at urban design and rural design and bring them together. Because cities and rural areas need to resolve the issues, because there's huge issues out there in terms of climate change and warming things, sea level rising. With climate change comes the danger of forest fires, and that's a huge concern in this area. And we all have seen what happened in California as to how vicious it can be. And when you have a lot of people living out in the woods, it can change things greatly. So design, I will talk about it again tonight, but as a problem-solving process, it can kind of bring people together to look at the issue collectively. And one of the things that's very important is that there's professional designers who use rural design, but then the public uses design all the time. You were the designer this morning when you decided what you were going to wear. So it's always there's always a decision, there's a problem, and a resolution of it. But I've learned over my 20 years with the Center for Rural Design at the University of Minnesota, working with rural communities, that if you're going to have an idea that will have strength and last, you've got to get the citizens involved in the planning process. Otherwise, if the elected officials just simply adapt it, you won't have the support that is necessary. Yeah. Rural is a very archaic definition of everything other than city. And yet that line between city and rural is very fuzzy. And I think historically we think of rural as really connected with agriculture and small rural towns and the growing of food. But times have changed, and each region, in Minnesota, for instance, we have 3 very distinct biomes going through the state, from the great prairie to a deciduous to a coniferous forest. You really hear very strongly in this one biome of coniferous forest. And so the issues of how you define rural are different. And when we had the design workshop here yesterday morning, I think this was, there was a lot of discussion about how do you define rural. And my trip out here seeing it for the first time is that it's, in some respects, it's like other rural areas, but you're so heavily forested. The agricultural land reserve, which is really a wonderful thing that British Columbia has put together. I think it's the only effort anywhere that I'm aware of that tried to preserve land for food. Well, but over the years I can see that's just rapidly kind of slipping away because there's a lot of land in this ALR that is not being used for agriculture. And so there's a growing thing called urban agriculture, and maybe that's one of the things about definition is for your region is how to redefine what rural means in terms of ALR, forestry, the recreational side of it, where people live, and then this whole issue of wildfire and climate change. All these things have to be talked about together, and I think that there's some pretty bright people out here that architects, landscape architects and planners that I encouraged them yesterday to start thinking of maybe a collaboration group that they can start dialogue, because of architects, we only talk to other architects. You know, all we talk about is buildings. Or landscape people, they only talk about the land, and we need to get that dialogue going. And then we need to engage with the public and help resolve some of these big issues that are coming down. And they're big issues here, but they're all over the world. These climate change, energy, food security, water resource, all of these are huge, huge issues. We're going to have another maybe 2.5 billion people on this planet by the year 2050. You know, we're around roughly 7 billion right now. I mean, what is that impact going to be? We don't, none of us know. And a lot of us, you know, as citizens, we should be thinking about that, but we're not doing much about it. And yet there's, I think there's ways to allow for the increase of people. There's also demographic change. You know, there's a lot more older people. And so you got retirees, and that's a new area. I mean, you're such a beautiful area. I think I've been told that there's a lot of retirees from around all over Canada who want to come here and retire because it's so beautiful and people are very nice and whatnot. And so it's all part of the design problem. It just has to be really looked at. You can't look at climate change by itself. You need to look at climate change, food security, water resources. All of these things need to be looked at simultaneously, because if you look at only one part of it, then there could be other things sneaking in the back door that, you know, so design is a way to kind of pull it all together, and that's what I argue about that rural design can do. I think there's one other thing I'd like to bring up about your region. You know, Duncan I find to be a very charming city, and yet as you filter out into these valleys, you know, there's these strings of housing and stuff that is going out. And I'm sure the people love to live there, but this issue of wildfire and logging, I mean, a lot of their forestry land is not controlled by anyone other than the forestry companies. And so I see signs saying, you know, no logging. I mean, there's a lot of tension going on. And so I think that CVR needs to really take a broad look and to try to find a consensus, working with the citizens to develop ideas as to how to link these issues and then find a resolution that works, and change it if it doesn't work. I mean, it's, you know, nothing is fixed forever. Design is available to everybody. Design is not something that is the exclusive property of professional designers. And design thinking is something that everybody can use. And and it's a way to resolve a problem by defining it, looking at alternative ideas for a solution, determining with citizens that of these ideas, this is the one that we like the best, and then pushing that forward into the elected officials to make it official. Because I know from experience that if the citizens aren't supportive of the idea, as I know how government officials are, there's a developer that comes in and say, well, we got a huge project here, we're going to invest $25 million, but you have to change the zoning or something like that. Well, without that strong community support, those elected officials often will say, yeah, oh, okay, we'll change it. And that's why I can see some of these spot changes that have been taking place here. There's another issue that I heard about is people, retirees, coming into the agricultural reserve, buying land, putting a big house on it, and not doing anything about agriculture. Now, how does that happen? I don't know. But those are, so I think the big idea is that design is a problem-solving process. And in my experience of bringing rural design to rural issues, which never existed before, but I'm really, the bottom line is that you've got to look at urban and rural simultaneously to really resolve the issues. Citizens, and that's probably, again, one of my sub-messages is that since they can, if they start thinking of themselves as a designer, then they can start organizing and putting forth this notion. But here's, I think, one of the great things that you've got going on in your Cowichan Valley is you've got this CVRD. You've got the structure here to look at it as a regional issue. A lot of areas are, I'll tell you, Minnesota, the 7 counties of the metropolitan area in Minnesota have a metropolitan council that does what your CVRD. The rest of the state is left all by itself. We had a state planning agency at one time, but that was politically eliminated, and it's a problem. I've been working to try to find ways to develop some of these regional idea thinking that you have. I mean, you're way above other parts of places in the United States, and maybe in Canada too. I don't know well enough about that. But I think you've got the basic structure here and organization to really do it well. And I think with the people that I met and the professionals that are living and working in this area. So you've got people, you've got this organization of CVRD, you've got all the bases here to really attack the problem. And in fact, I think the fact that I was invited out here is because you do have that structure here. So I think you have a very good opportunity to come to grips with that. Because it goes back to that very first question you asked about what is rural? How do you define rural? And you've got to define it here. You people, the citizens do. Not somebody like me coming and say, well, rural is this, rural is that, and not that, and that. That's just not the way it is. So your First Nations people, have 1,000 or more year history of living with this land and doing it in such a way that is sustainable. And I think that there are other places around the world. The United Nations have put forward this idea of globally important agricultural heritage systems. And my wife and I visited quite a few of these, but like the rice terraces in China. I mean, they've been terracing the land and controlling water, handling manure, and for over 1,000 years. I mean, it's just a beautiful landscape, and there's a lesson there that can help influence us all. So you have First Nations, or you have Indigenous people, or you have Aboriginal people. I mean, it's called different things around. But these are people that have lived for such a long period of time. I think we need to try to have a better dialogue with them to try to understand their background as to how it can help us, and hopefully in the exchange of dialogue that the immigrants, which most of us are, 100 years or whatever, can also then connect and probably offer some things to them. Because we're all in this, living on this planet together. And if we don't work together to save the planet and deal with some of the issues, there can be a real problem. And but I do see some good signs of that happening here. So I'm feeling very optimistic about your Cowichan Regional Valley Regional Development Group. I think it's very good because there's a real divide between urban and rural people. Maybe much more, not here so much, although there might be. There's a Professor Kramer, Elizabeth Kramer from the University of Wisconsin. She did a study of rural people, and it's very common. I saw it in my own work with the Center for Rural Design. One is that rural people don't trust urban people. Two, they think that the government, when they do things for a rural area, that it's top down, it's not bottom up in its approach. And three is that they think that urban people don't like them. And so that has kind of led to this divide. And so I've talked about, and I mentioned, the fact that it was rural America that elected Donald Trump as our president because of that divide. And this idea of keep America great, that going back to the way rural used to be, rather than looking at the way rural can be, that's a big problem. And so how you deal with that issue, I think, is really up to the citizens to kind of raise it as an issue, as you're doing with this series of lectures and inviting people like me to come out and try to open up the door to that kind of thing, because it's got to come from the citizens. You can't, we as citizens, we can't sit back and say, okay, you elected officials, tell us what to do, because, they'll come up with some kind of a thing. Here's one other point. When citizens get involved, I've learned that it's very critical to have a woman to be in charge of that citizens group. And because women have a more of a nurturing sense to build consensus with the citizen group, whereas the men want to kind of go in the back room and make the decision by themselves. County board members are almost always men. In fact, I was looking at the photographs of your Cowichan Valley Regional Group. Back in 26, I think there were 2 women. There's now 6 women on that board. So you can see how things are starting to change. Women are becoming much more involved, and I think that's a very good sign too. But ideas for change are always going to be best if it comes out of the citizens themselves. But I think you have a very great opportunity to show North America how to resolve these problems. So go in there and take charge and be bold and use design as a problem-solving process. And who knows what will happen.